afternoon, and thank you for inviting me back to your beautiful country and having me talk to you about something that we are struggling with in the United States. And I think you're struggling with a similar problem in Brazil. And so let me tell you about the challenge that we're wrestling with in the US and 6 ideas that we have to take on this challenge in the US. So I've titled my talk, The Biopharma Dilemma, Balancing Innovation and Affordability, because I think in the area of drugs, what we want is we want a lot of the innovation. We want new treatments for cancer. We want new treatments for diseases that affect children, like cystic fibrosis. We want treatments for Alzheimer's. So in other words, we want innovation. What we often don't know how to do is we don't exactly know how to pay for that innovation, because that innovation, as you all know, tends to be extremely expensive. So what we land up doing is we land up embarrassing the manufacturers when they do that innovation. So I'm going to share with you a number of ideas around how we can do a little bit better. So by way of disclosures, I want you to know a few things about me. I work for the Congressional Budget Office as a health advisor. This is the US federal government. And this CBO is the federal agency that is in charge of figuring out how much different pieces of legislation will cost the government. I've also accepted speaking fees from Biogen, Novo Nordisk, Pfizer, PCMA, and Roche. And I've been a consultant to Microsoft and a consulting company called Precision Health Economics. And I'm an advisor to 2 companies. So I want you to know all of that as I speak. So with that by way of introduction, let me tell you what one of the challenges that we're about to grapple with is. It is the challenge of innovation. So what I have for you over here is a snapshot into what the large biopharma companies are researching around the world. So if you look in the green boxes tell us that right now, today, there are about 6,234 molecules that are being studied by the large biopharma companies all around the world. So it could be Biogen, it could be Roche, it could be Eli Lilly. They're studying about 6,234 candidates for new medicines. The vast majority of those candidates are sitting in preclinical discovery. So they're in the lab stage of research. People haven't started to do human trials on those medicines. You can see that something like 1 in 6 drugs are in phase 1 of research. So phase 1 of research means that we have now started human trials to figure out if the drugs are actually dangerous or whether they might be actually therapeutic. And you can see, as you go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, you see fewer and fewer drugs in the later phases as we figure out which drugs are likely to work and which ones are not likely to work. What I want to draw your attention to is actually the blue boxes. What the blue boxes show you is the extent to which biopharma companies around the world are betting on oncology. So the oncology innovation accounts for somewhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of the total innovation that these companies are doing. Why is that important? It's important because, at least in my country, in the United States, it's very hard to say no to oncology drugs. It's actually a lot easier to say no to new treatments for diabetes and new treatments for congestive heart failure than it is to say no to oncology drugs. And my guess is that something similar happens in Brazil as well. And so we want to keep that focus on oncology in mind, not because oncology is the most important area of research, but because it's actually very hard to say no to oncology treatments. Now, in addition to saying no to oncology treatments, what physicians have to do is they also have to figure out which oncology treatments work and which ones don't work. So if you look at what is going to happen in the coming years, in the next 5 years, there's going to be an wave, an avalanche of new oncology treatments hitting the market. Right now, if you talk to oncologists, they will say, wow, there's been so much innovation. I really don't know what to do about this new drug from Bristol Myers Squibb versus this new oncology drug from AstraZeneca. They're complaining about the fact that today, in 2016, we see about 7 new combination therapies every year, and they're struggling to make sense of these 7 therapies. But if you go just a couple of years forward, 5 years from now, 5 years from now, there will be something like 34 new combination therapies entering this space. And so doctors, patients, health plans are going to have to make really good decisions around which one of those 34 combination therapies are the ones that they want to push, that they want to approve, that they want to give patients to access to. And that's going to be very, very hard to do, because to make sense of the 34 different combination therapies, we need much more than just approval by the FDA. We need actual clinical data on what the effectiveness of these drugs is in different populations. Now, in addition to the challenge of just figuring out which drugs work and which drugs don't work, there's this challenge, which is what I led with, which is the fact that a lot of the new oncology treatments are extremely expensive. So you can see the launch prices for new oncology treatments, and you can see at the bottom that on average, they're about $100,000. So this is a problem. Not only do we have a lot of treatments, and we want to figure out which are the good treatments and which are the not so good treatments, we're also faced with very, very high prices. Not only are the prices very high, what often happens in oncology, as you all know, is that the drug can be very cost effective in some patients, but not so cost effective in other patients. So you take a drug like Tarceva, which is a terrific drug, right? You take a drug like Tarceva and you use it for something like first-line treatment of metastatic small cell lung cancer. It's an expensive drug, but it's actually worth it, despite the fact that it's expensive. But now if we try to use this drug for something like pancreatic cancer, even though it's a great drug, pancreatic cancer is such a terrible disease that this drug only generates 12 days of survival. So we might want to use this drug for metastatic non-small cell lung cancer, but it's not clear that we want to use the drug for pancreatic cancer. And we're going to have to make sense of how these 34 therapies work in these something like 19 to 20 different tumor types. So that is an incredible challenge that I think confronts us around the world. So I apologize for the slight delay here, but I'm going to go to this next slide because I told you about everything that was on this slide. Okay, so one of the final things that we have to think about going forward is the fact that in the past, health plans, health insurers were able to negotiate lower prices by going to drug manufacturers and saying, you know, your therapy is no better than this other therapy, so I want a discount. We were able to do that, and that was our business model for many, many years. Our ability to do that is going to fall in the coming years. And the reason it's going to fall in the coming years is that for the first time, we're seeing multi-manufacturer combination therapies. What that means is 2 different manufacturers have got together and they're producing one therapy together. If the 2 manufacturers are producing one therapy, it's very hard to play one therapy against another therapy because there is only one therapy, right? So this move towards multi-manufacturer therapies could be very good for patients because, as you know, patients are rarely treated by a single agent. They're often treated by combination therapies. But if they're treated by combination therapies, and those combination therapies are all being sold by one manufacturer, it becomes much harder for health plans to ask for a discount. And then I think on top of it, my last slide of bad news before I start to give you good news, my last slide of bad news is that if you look at kind of where the innovation is moving into riskier and riskier areas of medicine. So focus on the fact that what I have for you in these funnel plots is the failure rate for discovery in different disease areas. The first funnel plot is for HCV, that's hepatitis C. And what that funnel plot tells you is that for every 30 molecules that entered preclinical discovery, only 1 was actually successful. Or in other words, for every 100 molecules entering drug discovery, which is even before preclinical discovery, only 2 actually made it to launch. So the actual success rate is 2% for hepatitis C treatments. Now, but if you come next to it, I've got for you the failure rates in Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's is an area of medicine where a lot of the large biopharma companies are very active right now. I come from Boston, and Boston has a lot of these companies. Biogen, which is one of the big biopharma companies, and their office is right next to mine, Biogen is mostly investing in Alzheimer's right now. And if you go to Eli Lilly or you go to AstraZeneca, that's also what they're doing. But what you can see is that the failure rates in Alzheimer's discovery are extremely high. The success rate is very low. For every 200 molecules that these companies start with, only one makes it successfully. And what that means is that if one of these companies were to deliver a disease-modifying treatment for Alzheimer's, that company would charge a very, very high price because that company dealt with these failure rates for decades. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about cancer. We spend a lot of time talking about cystic fibrosis. But I think the medicine, the science behind the medicine on Alzheimer's is getting better. And it's only a question of time before some company somewhere develops something wonderful for Alzheimer's. And the whole world will want it because there's Alzheimer's all over the world. There's Alzheimer's in the US, there's Alzheimer's in India, there's Alzheimer's in China, there's Alzheimer's in Brazil. But those drugs will be extremely expensive. And I don't think we have a good sense of how we're going to pay for those drugs. So I'm just going to summarize the first part of my talk. The first part of my talk is just a summary of the things I've told you about. I'm going to make 4 bold predictions about the future. 2 of them concern innovation. And my prediction is that we're going to see even more innovation in the years to come. One reason is that in the United States, we just insured 30 million people as a result of the Affordable Care Act. This was a wonderful thing. But now for 30 million people, manufacturers have the ability to treat 30 million more people. So that's an expansion in market size, and they'll respond by doing more innovation. In the US, we also have the 21st Century Cures Act, which is right now still stuck in our Congress, but is soon expected to come out of Congress. But when it comes out of Congress, it will make it easier for the FDA to approve drugs based on surrogate endpoints. And if you can approve drugs based on surrogate endpoints, we're likely to see more innovation, because we've reduced the barrier to do that innovation. So I think for both of those reasons, we're likely to see more innovation in the US. And if you see more innovation in the US, it's more innovation for the rest of the world. Now, innovation's a wonderful thing. My next 2 predictions are about prices. I think the prices are likely to be extremely high for at least 2 reasons. The first reason is that these multi-manufacturer combination therapies, while great for patients, are actually bad for insurers, because insurers now will no longer be able to play one company against another company. And then I think, as I just said, this move into riskier and riskier areas of discovery, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, will mean higher drug prices. So I think this dilemma that I started off with, the dilemma about how do you balance innovation against affordability, is a big dilemma today in 2016. But it's likely to be a much larger dilemma in 2026, 10 years from now, for all of these reasons. So that was the setup of kind of what we're likely to face going forward. And so what I want to talk about next is a couple of ideas about what we can do. And there's many things we can do, and I would be thrilled to come back and work through the logic of what are the things we should do and what are the things we should not do. I don't want to spend a lot of time on what we should not do, with the exception of one thing. I want to talk about one particular thing that we should not do, which is high deductible health plans. So high deductible health plans have been very popular in the US, and someone like me is very guilty of having been on the side of saying high deductible health plans are a great way to save money, because the intuition is that a patient now has to shop around, they have some skin in the game, they're going to find a better deal, and so they'll save money. That's what someone like me said until last year. So if you look at all my research, a lot of my research was on the benefits of these high deductible health plans. But I didn't really know what they did. I had a lot of theory, and a lot of stories about what they did, but I didn't really know what they did. So to figure out what they did, I worked with a very large company in the US. It's a company whose products, I can't tell you the name of the company, but it's a company whose products I'm sure are on your table at work or in your house, guaranteed. This company took all its employees and overnight moved them to a high deductible health plan. So we were able to study what a high deductible health plan actually does to spending. And here's what we found. It turns out high deductible health plans do save money. There's no question about that. You were right about that. I was right about that. They actually save a lot of money. They even save more money than I thought they saved. They save somewhere between 12 to 15%. So imagine taking your healthcare spending and being able to reduce it 12 to 15% just as a result of moving to a high deductible health plan. That's really exciting. So why am I against high deductible health plans? The reason is everything else that high deductible health plans did to patients. The first thing that we found was that patients cut back on every kind of care when they were in the high deductible health plan. So they were not only cutting back on the medicines that sometimes don't work or on the treatments that sometimes don't work, like advanced imaging. We found patients were cutting back on the drugs that do work, like beta blockers for hypertension or ACE inhibitors for patients with congestive heart failure. We found that patients were cutting back on prevention. And if you cut back on prevention, that's actually a really bad thing because you might land up in the hospital 6 months later or 2 years later. The other thing that we realized was that about half of the savings from these high deductible health plans, so about, I said the total savings were 12 to 15%, so half of that, somewhere between 6% to 8%, came from the sickest patients. The sickest patients are over the deductible. They shouldn't be cutting back at all. But they were the ones cutting back a lot. And I think one of the things we learned was that patients have no idea how complicated these high deductible health plans are. So when you put them in a high deductible health plan, even when they work their way through the deductible, they still think that the coinsurance rates are extremely high and they'll end up cutting back. And the fourth thing that we found in the high deductible health plan study that we did was we found absolutely no evidence of any kind of price shopping. So one of the things that you're supposed to see with high deductible health plans is that patients are supposed to be able to shop, right? We want them looking for better deals and going from more expensive providers to less expensive providers. We gave the patients in our experiment all the tools about who the cheaper providers were, and we could measure electronically whether they were actually using those tools. And we found absolutely no evidence of price shopping. So the logic that underlies the high deductible health plan is sound, but it's sound only on one dimension. It's only sound on the dimension of reducing spending. It's not sound on the dimension of improving health. So I feel quite strongly that out of all the things that we do, this is something that I think we should be very careful about. And we shouldn't just be careful about rolling it out slowly. I think we should not roll it out at all until we understand how to design high deductible health plans better so that patients are not cutting back in ways that they don't completely understand. So that was one idea about something we should not do. My next 5 ideas are about things that we should do. So let me start with kind of where we are there. One of the things that we've started to see in the United States is we've started to see the big organizations like ASCO, the American Society for Clinical Oncology, a group like ICER, Institute for Clinical Effectiveness Research, Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is one of the great cancer centers in New York City, and NCCN, which is the sort of the group that represents the large cancer centers. They have all begun in the past 2 years to measure the value from different drugs, from different chemotherapies, from different, treatments for cancer. And this, I think, is a very, very good thing because it's going to help insurers figure out which therapies work and which therapies don't work. This table comes from a paper that I published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a few weeks ago. And in that article, if you read the article, you can tell I'm a little critical of all of these endeavors. I'm critical because I don't think that the enterprise today is perfect. I think it's actually fraught with a lot of problems. But I do think that the overall enterprise of asking for the first time, how do these drugs compare against each other, and are these drugs worth the cost, is something that we should applaud. And my hope is that even though these initiatives are flawed today, some future version of these initiatives will start to measure the value of drugs that patients really care about. So right now, I think a lot of these initiatives are measuring things like survival and toxicity. But what we also want them to do is to measure pain and nausea. If there is a therapy that allows a cancer patient to be treated, but with less nausea, that's actually a really, really valuable therapy. And we should be willing to pay more for drugs with fewer side effects. Toxicity is an extreme form of side effect. And so I think what I would encourage all these frameworks to do is to keep doing the good work that they're doing, because they are central to our ability to be able to do value-based pricing in the years to come. So my second idea is one that I think is common around the world. So this is not a new idea, but I'll tell you the new idea version of it. If you look at pharmaceutical spending in the United States, you can see that about 70% of it is branded drugs. 30% of it is generic drugs. I think we have a huge opportunity with generic drugs, even more than we have seen. I think that there are a lot of branded drugs where PBMs, pharmacy benefit manufacturers, and health plans can accelerate the take-up of generics. And I think that's a good thing, because I don't think that when you have a generic, you should really be on the branded drug. There is a problem with the generics market, at least in the United States. As we all know from our good friend Martin Shkreli, who raised the price of Daraprim by 1,500% in a week, the market for generic drugs is actually broken. And it's broken because of this reason. Over here, on the x-axis, I show you the market for drugs as a function of how many generic manufacturers we have. So when you have just one generic manufacturer, the generic price is 94%, on average, the price of the branded drug. So simply having generics or one generic manufacturer is not enough. And we just saw that in the US with what Milan did with the EpiPen. You know, the EpiPen, there should be lots of generics for the EpiPen in some sense. There should be a lot of competition for the EpiPen, but there's only one manufacturer. And so that one manufacturer can charge very, very high prices. It's only when you get up to 8 or 9 generic manufacturers that you get the full advantage of the generic industry. It's only then that the generic prices are 20% the price of the branded drug. So we need to do a lot more thinking about how to have a robust market for generics. And that's something that in the US we've not done. In the US we've said, oh, we allow generics to come in, and that's good enough. It's not good enough, because if you allow generics to come in, maybe you just have one generic coming in, and that's really not going to generate the kinds of price savings that we want patients to enjoy. So related to the idea of generics is a new idea, and the new idea is biosimilars, which are very new, and I think from what I learned from my friend Misha, from what I understand, is that Brazil just approved its first biosimilar not so recently. Now, the opportunity with biosimilars is enormous, as you can see from this graph. This graph is showing us the names of the drugs that are coming off of patent. So these are large molecule biologics that are rolling off patent. And these are some of the most expensive drugs out there in the marketplace, right? So Neulasta, for example, is very, very expensive, and it's coming off of market. Novolog is coming off market. In the past, generics couldn't enter, so it didn't matter if the patent expired. There was no way for some generic alternative to the biologic to enter. We didn't have these biosimilars. Biosimilars are like generics, but for very, very big molecules. And the drugs that treat cancer, the drugs that treat rheumatoid arthritis, are big molecule drugs, and I'll show you that in a second. So it didn't really matter that these drugs were going off patent. There was really no way for the biosimilars to enter. In 2010, as part of the ACA in the US, we allowed these biosimilars to enter. And the US has now approved 3 biosimilars. One was approved last year in April. Another one was approved earlier this year. And just yesterday, day before yesterday, the FDA in the US allowed Novartis to introduce a biosimilar for Amgen's Enbrel drug, right? So that's really, really exciting news. But this biosimilar industry is a very new, nascent industry, and so we have to be careful about how we treat this industry. Let me tell you why it's important to kind of be careful about this biosimilar industry. You can see all the way over on the left the aspirin molecule. Look at the size of the aspirin molecule. The aspirin molecule in size is 150 daltons wide. 1 dalton is approximately the size of the hydrogen atom. So aspirin is about 150 times the size of the hydrogen atom. Now you look at insulin right next to it. That is about 5,500 daltons in size. Now come all the way over to the right. On the right are the monoclonal antibodies. So these would be things like bevacizumab, which you might know as Avastin. The size of the bevacizumab molecule is 150,000 times the size of a conventional hydrogen atom. It is an incredibly complicated drug to make. The original drug is very complicated to make, so the copy of that drug, the biosimilar, is also going to be incredibly complicated to make. And so we want to be sure that when we approve these biosimilars, we don't approve them too quickly, because it might take us years to figure out how, whether the biosimilar is as good as the original product that it's competing under. So, to summarize, I think biosimilars are a great idea. I applaud the fact that we now have 3 biosimilars in the US. I look forward to a world in which we can have many, many more biosimilars. But biosimilars are ultimately trying to copy biologics, and biologics are proteins. They're not like little small molecule drugs like aspirin. They are living proteins, and so unsurprisingly, duplicating them requires incredible knowledge of advanced manufacturing, and it also requires the manufacturer of the biosimilar to do a lot more data collection and clinical trials to get regulatory approval. So my point on biosimilars is, I think there's a huge opportunity ahead of us, and health plans that think about adopting biosimilars carefully stand to gain in the years to come, because there's going to be, as my next slide shows, many more biosimilars in the years to come. So these circles show you where we are in biosimilar development for some of the large molecule drugs. So you can see, for something like filgrastim, you can see we've got a couple of drugs that are biosimilars that are in the preclinical stage, one that is in phase 1 or 2, but you can also see that there have been 2 approvals in dark blue. So this slide was made day before yesterday. That's the only reason that there aren't 3 things in dark blue, because until day before yesterday, at least in the US, there were only 2. But you can see there are many companies thinking about introducing biosimilars, and so we want to be ahead of figuring out which one of these biosimilars works and which ones can be used as a replacement for the original reference product. So here's another idea. This is idea number 4 for something we should be thinking about. This is money-back guarantees or drug warranties, or you might call them outcomes-based contracts. So these are contracts between insurers and manufacturers where we agree to pay the manufacturer more if the drug works better. Another way to structure the deal is the manufacturer pays the insurance company money if the drug doesn't work as well as the manufacturer had claimed. So you can see in medicine, we've already got a little bit of this money back thing already happening. It's not happening in the pharmaceutical industry. In the US, it's happening in the IVF industry. So this is fertility treatments. There's a company called IntegraMed in the US. IntegraMed will give you back your money. They'll give you back somewhere between 70% and 100% of all your money if you don't get a baby as a result of going to IntegraMed for IVF. It would be terrific to see similar contracts for cancer drugs and similar contracts for cystic fibrosis drugs, where if the manufacturer claims that we should see a reduction in cancer progression or an increase in lung function for CF patients, if the manufacturer is not able to deliver on that claim, then the manufacturer should have to pay money back to the health insurer, right? So that would be a terrific thing to do. And I think oncology is a great place to start that conversation. So we've got a number of different drugs on this slide, like Avastin, like Herceptin, like Rituxan. These are very expensive drugs. We know that they have different response rates in different patients. So Avastin might work incredibly well in patients with colon cancer, but it might have a much smaller response rate in patients with breast cancer. So we could enter into some sort of a drug warranty or outcomes-based contract where if we're able to measure these response rates carefully and for each specific tumor type, we might be able to contract on how well the drug is performing in these different tumor types. Now this, let me just say, what I just said is something we should be doing more of, but it's hard to do. You need incredibly good data to be able to do an outcomes-based contract. Because if we don't have good data, it could be the case that patients are simply not taking their drugs, and so it looks like the drug isn't working, but the reality is that patients are simply not adherent with their drug. So this is we haven't solved everything around outcomes-based contracting. I think we are in our very early days. And so my last thought is something that I believe very much in, which is that at the end of the day, given the avalanche of new medical therapies that will be released onto us in the next 5 to 10 years, at the end of the day, there's probably no substitute to putting physicians in charge in the form of giving them bundle payments or episode payments to take care of certain well-defined clinical conditions. We've seen United, the health insurance company United, this is the largest private health insurance company in the United States. United has done some really exciting work in the US in experimenting with these bundle payments. What they did was they did a pilot. So this is just a pilot. What United did was they piloted an idea for 19 different cancer types with the oncology practice, where they paid the oncology practice a fixed amount of money. And that money made the oncology practice responsible for everything about the patient's care. So not only the patient's cancer care, but if the patient had a heart attack, that money was coming out of this bundle payment for cancer. If the patient had to be admitted for congestive heart failure, that money was coming out of this bundle payment. The oncologists were free to use whatever chemotherapy they wanted to use, but they had to figure out which chemotherapy they wanted to use. The oncologists were free to admit the patient to the hospital as often as they wanted, but the money was coming out of this bundle payment. So what actually happened with this pilot program? What happened with the pilot program was something very interesting. Total medical spending fell by about 1/3. We saved a lot of money as a result of this bundle payment. A lot. Nobody expected it to save 30%, which is a lot of savings. But spending on chemotherapy actually went up by something like 180%. Now, I don't know if this result is general. This was a pilot program. It was really not even picking up what happened to patient outcomes. I think we need many more such programs implemented around the world before we decide that this is the right way forward. But I think there is something wonderful about giving physicians the right incentives, because if you give physicians the right incentives, it means that the rest of us don't have to be in there trying to micromanage physicians on what drugs to prescribe for which conditions. Physicians have a relationship with their patient, and when they tell their patients that a particular drug will not work for them, patients often say, "You're right." But if it's the insurance company that tells the patient, "We're not going to cover this drug," the patients then hate the insurance companies, as you all know. So I think there's something about putting doctors in charge of all of this, which could be a terrific way for us to kind of get around the original dilemma that confronted us in the first place. So on this idea of physicians showing us the way, I think you need a couple of ingredients, and we don't have all the ingredients just yet. I think one of the reasons that it doesn't always work is that for bundle payments to work really, really well, what you need is 5 things. You need knowledge of costs. So doctors have to know what different things actually cost them. Doctors have no idea what things actually cost them. So if you put doctors under a bundle payment and you say now you're responsible for the totality of patient care, the doctors often, at least in the US, don't know that a hospitalization costs $16,000 or costs $40,000. They just say, go to the hospital, right? We'll admit you for this particular surgery that you need for your colon cancer. So you need knowledge of costs, and most hospitals don't really know their cost structure very well. The second thing you need is very rich data on longitudinal outcomes. By longitudinal outcomes, I mean long-term outcomes, so that doctors who use this chemotherapy versus that chemotherapy can see whether the patients who took the first chemotherapy were less likely to be admitted to the emergency room as a result of a side effect or a seizure. But to be able to do that, doctors need to be able to track where their patients are showing up when they go to the emergency room. In the city that I live in, Boston, which is at the heart of biomedical innovation, we have one of the greatest cancer centers within a mile of where I live, called the Dana-Farber Cancer Center, named after Sidney Farber, the great oncologist who was one of the fathers of modern chemotherapy in the last century. Even at the Dana-Farber, which is one of America's greatest hospitals, if I'm a cancer patient at the Dana-Farber and I'm getting treated at the Dana-Farber, but as a result of some side effects of the treatment, I have to go to the hospital, and my wife takes me to any hospital that is not the Dana-Farber doctors will not know that I went to this other hospital. They'll never be able to see that patient record. They would never know that this patient had these side effects. So it's very hard for doctors to do the right thing in the absence of this incredible ability to see things in real time, which requires incredible information technology in return. The third thing that doctors will need for this to work is that they will need loyal patients. It can't be the case that patients are coming to Sao Paulo for cancer treatment, and then when they are free of cancer, they go back to Rio or go back to some other part of Brazil for the rest of their care. If a lot of that is happening, the doctors in Sao Paulo will never really learn what long-term survival was, right? Or even if the Sao Paulo patients are going to 30 different hospitals in Sao Paulo, the doctors at the one hospital that's treating them will never really know what was happening at the 29 other hospitals that admitted their patient. So doctors will need access to loyal patients, and that's something that insurance plans could design. Insurance plans could design networks that actually encourage patients to stay loyal to certain doctors or certain doctor groups. The fourth thing that we need is scientific credibility. I don't think that every hospital in America or every hospital in Brazil has the scientific credibility to take on bundle payments. And the reason I say that is bundle payments will only save money if doctors are actually saying no to cancer treatments from time to time. But that requires scientific credibility. If a for-profit hospital is saying no to cancer treatments all the time, patients will say, well, you're a for-profit hospital. The reason you're saying no to these treatments is because you're getting paid by a bundle payment and you're keeping the difference every time you don't treat me with some really expensive therapy. So I think we need a lot of scientific credibility by the doctors and the hospitals to be able to say to the patient, trust me, this drug doesn't actually work for you. It has nothing to do with the financial incentives that we face. And finally, I think this is something that we all know about healthcare, but it's often forgotten, is we need an extraordinary amount of humility and courage. The stories that I've told you about and the opportunities that I've shared with you are unlikely to be executed perfectly the first time we try them. I think that there's going to be a lot of failure in their first and second and perhaps third incarnations. And I think we need the humility to learn from our mistakes so that we can actually improve these expert systems for us 10 years from now, or for our children 20 years from now. And I think that takes a combination of humility, tenacity, and courage. And that, I think, is often lacking. At least in American medicine, it's lacking a lot. So I'm going to leave you with with those 4 ideas for the way forward and just give you a very quick wrap-up for why we got to where we did. I do believe that we're at a very exciting period in our history. If you look at where we are in terms of immunotherapy for cancer and CAR therapy for cancer, or whether we look even further ahead to the possibility of cell therapies and gene therapies for very rare diseases, and we think about a world in which we might finally start to see disease-modifying drugs for Alzheimer's, it is really an extraordinary time that we live in. But we also know, as a result of everything that I shared with you, that these therapies are likely to be incredibly expensive. They're likely to be valuable, but expensive. But if they're valuable, it's going to be very hard for us to tell the citizens of our countries we're not going to cover them. So we're going to have to do something about trying to cover these therapies. And I think there's a range of things that we have to do over here, but I think there are many opportunities. And I think reforming the delivery system to move more towards bundle payments is one really, really terrific opportunity that we have in front of us. We've started the move towards bundle payments in the US. We started it back in 1981 with DRGs. But we started with DRGs in 1981, but then we didn't do anything for something like 25 years. So now we're going back to the old DRGs and making them more like the bundle payments that I talked to you about. And I think one thing that holds us back in the US, which is a great opportunity for Brazil, is the US is always held back with a lot of legacy legislation that we wrote in the 1960s or 1970s. And as you all know, it's very hard to undo bad legislation that was written 50 years ago. You have an opportunity because you don't have you're not shackled by 50 years of bad legislation. So one of the things that always delights me about coming to Brazil is that I think you could show all of us in the US the way forward on managing this dilemma between innovation and affordability. Thank you.